All right, thank you, Chris. Welcome, Dave. Good to have you.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me today.
Well, thanks to the innovation from Lilly, I think I was able to have 2 cookies today, so appreciate that.
You're welcome.
So we'll start first with neuroscience at Lilly. So you guys just had the Trailblazer ALS 2 study for donanemab, a successful trial, and we'll see some detail, next month at the AAIC meeting. Maybe bring us to a level where how you think, tau can be used, how you think this drug could commercially roll out, and then we can get into later, maybe about just broader access through CMS, et cetera.
Yeah, sure. Well, we're excited by our recent results from our Trailblazer 2 program, which confirmed positive benefit in patients for Alzheimer's. Really the first time a drug has had a proof of concept signal and then replicated. So that's very confidence building, along with just the outcome of that study. Of course, Alzheimer's work has been super difficult and lately kind of noisy in the regulatory and reimbursement environment. But the data will speak for themselves. We're presenting a full package at AAIC and hope to submit to the FDA very soon and be approved shortly in the US and other global markets. We designed, I guess the tail of getting to where we were with the positive replication is really a function of 2 things. One, much better ascertainment of what the right patient to study is. And that was a story about, as you mentioned, tau, but before that, even amyloid characterization and moving away from clinical impression to more pathology to characterize and bracket patients in early Alzheimer's. That took about 10 years to figure out, and Lilly pioneered that. Actually, Dan Skrovansky, our chief scientific officer, founded Avid, the company we bought, which invented a lot of that technology. And then the other side, of course, is better drugs. I think we've learned along the way that you need to pursue neurodegenerative diseases much more like we do cancer. I know cancer's been a topic here today and yesterday. With no regret dosing at the beginning, making sure you're hitting the target and doing it very aggressively, that you don't rely on combinations to demonstrate effect size, that single agent activity is critical. And when you see it early, you know. And if you don't see it early, you probably also know. And for a long time, I think pharmaceutical developers chased some vapor of, probably data that was real, but an effect size that wasn't big enough. Putting those 2 together, we came up with the donanemab program, the Trailblazer program, and I think, as we said, demonstrated 35% slowing on the major outcome measures. Maybe more impressively, almost 50% of the patients in the first year had no progression on CDR sum of boxes. So really halting disease progression, which is a hallmark of Alzheimer's. And then about half the patients finished therapy within a year. So it's a one and done approach. Excited to get that in the market and talk to the government about paying for it.
Right. And on that note, you have one competitor today, and who knows going forward. There's a lot of really innovative science in the neuro field. But what would you say, Dave, would be the tipping point, I think, to open the aperture for CMS, to provide sort of a seamless diagnostic and therapeutic experience?
I think we're past the tipping point if we're talking about evidence, to be honest. So now it's more about the political tipping point, perhaps. Right. Alzheimer's is a reasonably common neurodegenerative disease. It's the 7th leading cause of death in America, and it's the only one without a disease-modifying drug. So I guess our position is we don't understand why we're here right now. Of course, wind back the clock 2 years ago, a CED based on accelerated approval for aducanumab. Okay, very different circumstances, but I think 2 separate drugs with slightly different data sets, but definitively positive. Ours is a replication of a phase 2, so I think that really is the gold standard of evidence, is show it twice sequentially. It's a condition that I think if we had this outcome in other neuroscience conditions, we'd be super pleased to pay for it. I think to slow neurodegenerative conditions at all is impressive. It's hard to understand or defend their position at this point. I think it needs to change. And I suspect the patients and physicians will agree with that and mount pressure, and then it's a political question of when pressure changes that. There's another alternative, which is they've staked in this position of coverage with evidence development. What they haven't staked out is what that actually means. If what that means is almost nothing, then effectively maybe you have broad reimbursement with a little bit of paperwork. I don't understand why we need a little bit of paperwork, but that may be something that when they announce the policy in full, I guess following lecanemab's approval in July, we'll know more about.
Right. And on the innovation side of things, the long term, in theory, a lot of investors and a lot of researchers think you could have beta amyloid therapy as the foundation, and then you add on something else, and maybe tau is that, maybe it's not. But what do you see at Lilly and for the field in general for moving the ball beyond the effect size that we've seen for lecanemab and donanemab?
Yeah, so I think first of all, this is, I think, a beachfront against Alzheimer's, but also maybe neurodegenerative conditions in general. I think there's three basic strategies we were pursuing. You're highlighting one of them, which is adding combinations, more modalities. That would make the most sense beyond the population we just studied, which was a mild Alzheimer's population. Clearly, as Alzheimer's develops, people develop tauopathy, and halting that process seems like a good idea. We're pursuing that currently with a small molecule approach. We've tried large molecule approaches that were difficult to demonstrate proof of concept. So we'll see as that develops, but we have a phase 1 program now that'll be moving forward to phase 2 soon. That would be an obvious combination. In our case, maybe sequential, not combination, because you might treat with donanemab to slow the disease early and then later add the tau reducer. That's strategy 1. Strategy 2, I think, is really to pursue intervention at a different point in time. Alzheimer's develops probably over the course of 1 or 2 decades, and much like we think about cardiovascular disease or other hallmark diseases of the aging, we have time to get in front of it if we can detect it and better stratify patients based on risk. We do have a program right now in accruing, Trailblazer 3, which seeks to find people with high levels of amyloid but no symptoms. And that will be an interesting study to follow. We just had an attempt at that with solanezumab, another Lilly antibody that failed, but I think we learned a lot about the translation rate of that population into outright Alzheimer's diagnosis. And if you look at the data set around donanemab in early Alzheimer's, we've commented, you'll find it very encouraging if you use it earlier in that spectrum. So going even before symptoms might be quite promising. That's strategy 2. I think the third one is to really try to halt production of these proteins to begin with. We, along with others, are looking at ASO and mRNA or siRNA-based approaches to do that. And I think broadly for neurodegeneration, that's a very promising strategy, particularly when you have multiple proteins causing problems like in certain Parkinson's and ALS forms. So really getting into nucleic acid therapeutics and genetic medicines.
Perfect. Well, let's switch gears to diabetes, and we'll get to obesity next. So, Mounjaro approved and has had a fantastic launch so far. I guess the question is, what's been surprising to you about the receptivity in diabetes, and then when you look forward, what do you think are kind of the next, kind of milestones that we'll get in terms of next generation therapies and access? I think is still pretty good.
Yeah. So in diabetes, we launched Mounjaro last June, but we'll break every record in our company's history in terms of adoption. It's currently available in the US, Japan, and a few of the Gulf countries. The reason for that lack of global rollout, it really has been supply. So I've been around the industry a long time. I've never launched something that we ran out of so quickly, and that's an unfortunate thing, but it also speaks to the demand that we're seeing. And people say, well, is that mostly off-label weight loss? There is off-label weight loss use. We're very focused on the diabetes population, and there alone, because we can track it carefully based on prior medication use, we've seen almost a doubling in the use of incretins as a broad class. So these are GLPs plus Mounjaro, which is a combination GIP, GLP. in a year. That's incredible because they were widely used medicines to begin with. And I think this idea we've held for a long time, even going back 2 or 3 generations of medicines ago, of treating diabetes in a way like we treat other conditions, where we try to hit the disease with the best tools first, slow it down, because it's really a disease of continuous failure and eventually pancreatic exhaustion and insulin resistance, and then you're on insulin. Getting in front of all that with a very potent molecule that can hope to knock the disease backwards in time, people are actually starting to do. Now, we're not at the place where we can say, well, let's take pre-diabetes. That may be difficult from a regulatory perspective, but certainly in diabetes, we're seeing these drugs used much, much earlier. I think 40% of Mounjaro use is having only used metformin, which means people are skipping all over other oral therapies. That's a new idea, really. Beyond this, of course, we have under review at the FDA the chronic weight management and obesity indication. And I was mentioning to you backstage, Lilly has 5 clinical stage incretins or incretin combinations under development right now. And currently, at last count, we had 36 phase 3 studies of these medicines looking at a really wide swath of outcomes measures due to the consequences of obesity. The most important ones are, for instance, we have this study called multiple metabolic outcomes, which is looking at all-cause mortality, certain cancer rates, certainly cardiovascular and cardiovascular interventions, major cardiovascular interventions. So I think that's going to be important. Obviously, that's the most important cluster. But next year, we'll get data in both heart failure and sleep apnea, which are acute conditions that are known to be tied to obesity, and then other molecules with even broader programs. So our aim is bold here. I think we know obesity and excessive weight is sort of a key to disease progression way beyond diabetes and other metabolic conditions, key to health, and perhaps we can improve the health of a lot of people through this class of medicines.
And just on the obesity front, I guess the question is, has the demand been surprising to you? And then the second thing is, when you look at the manufacturing supply, you mentioned that earlier, right? So there are a lot of challenges with meeting the pretty robust demand, which is expected the next 1 to 10 years, let's call it.
Yeah, it's true. There's 2 major manufacturers of these drugs, us and our colleagues at Novo Nordisk. I think for the midterm, we're sort of locked into the decisions we've already made because asset delivery time is measured in years here, 3 or 4. Between the 2 companies last year, we probably made enough injectable GLP-1 and Mounjaro GIP/GLP for about 12 or 13 million people globally. So if we extrapolate to the population we're targeting, which is 100 million potential people in the United States, 600 million in the developed world, maybe approaching 1 billion globally, we're just a really long way from supplying anything like a meaningful part of that market. But efforts are underway between those companies to pretty dramatically expand that footprint, doubling again, et cetera. So the line is up and to the right for sure, and it will get better and better. The challenge will be, fully meeting the needs of that market with, a product form that is literally the most difficult thing we do. It's a synthetic peptide in a parenteral system and then an auto-injector built around it. It is, as far as pharma manufacturing goes, super challenging. It's one of the reasons we have a lot of prioritization on our oral solid program, which is called orforglipron. It's a GLP-1 agonist that's a true small molecule. And that, I think, will allow us to scale in a very, very different way. We're a couple of years away from that, but those phase 3 studies are enrolling now. And efficacy will be a little less than Mounjaro, certainly less than the triple G, the 3-way agonist that's in phase 3, but probably something about what we see with semaglutide right now, and could scale to 10, 100x the current setup.
So multiple assets, multiple modalities to treat a very large, population. But when you think about access, how do you think about when you have formal approval this fall, I'm presuming, for obesity and next year, and really a global type of rollout. But how do you think about access starting in the U.S. from commercial and government payers?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously thin right now. I think if we look at Wegovy, it's got about 40-ish% of commercial lives have some form of access. That deserves an asterisk because many employers who've enabled access to weight loss medications have criteria or step kind of functions where you have to have tried other medications or been in a lifestyle modification program successfully, et cetera. So there's conditions. It's difficult to predict the Part D, the Medicare decision. That's currently barred, and so we need a legislative change to get there, and legislating anything is probably really hard, even though it certainly will save the government a lot of money over time if they use these medications. Medicaid, maybe even farther away. That's a kind of proxy for the world, by the way. I think we'll see countries with well-funded healthcare systems adopt for parts of their population. UK, for instance, is funding these medications in BMIs over 35, which is interesting. And other countries saying it's out-of-pocket only. What I do know is that I think many of the phase 3 programs will demonstrate hard outcomes on everything from sleep apnea, machine rentals, to hospitalizations, or even cancer diagnosis. Many of those will work. And by, say, 2030, we'll probably be asking ourselves why these aren't much more widely used and reimbursed. But it will take time, as most things do in the adoption of new innovation in our business, and evidence. And it's up to us to produce that evidence. That's what we're doing. And that takes time because we have to watch events in humans. But I'm confident on that time scale, this will be more or less solved. Maybe in the interim, one other thing to mention is there certainly will be an out-of-pocket market in the US and other markets. There certainly will be a reimbursed market, perhaps stratified by disease severity. There may also be, in the employer segment especially, the emergence of a middle market, where there'll be some subsidy but not as complete as we see with full medical insurance. And there's some interest in that. We've been in a number of conversations about that with plan providers, PBMs, et cetera. So that's, feels like a half measure, but maybe that's better than no measure at all. And we could see some improvement in reimbursement in commercial markets that way.
How important are cardiovascular outcomes in both in obesity in the longer term, and I guess your study in diabetes is relatively closer to securing broader access, and you don't have to prove the totality of the benefit, but I think to a payer you may that may tip the scales.
I think it's one thing. For some payers, it may tip the scales. I don't see any of these outcome studies as singularly the thing. There's a lot of focus on Novo's SELECT study coming up. Maybe you're asking for that reason. And that'll be good if it's positive. I think it'll incrementally move the market. I don't think it's dispositive on the coverage for everyone. If that were true, when we saw hard outcome data that was very positive, we'd always get coverage in insurance, and that's not what occurs in any part of the healthcare economy. But I do think over time, the quantity of evidence being produced, not just by Lilly, as I mentioned, 36 phase 3s, but by our competitor too, I think will make it hard to avoid the reality that these drugs will be very important for longevity and improving human health and reducing healthcare costs.
Right. And when we're talking about access in the metabolic space, so talk a little bit about your affordability initiatives with respect to insulin.
Yeah, sure. Obviously, we have. We're proud to serve insulin users. Actually, about 100 years ago this month, we shipped our first commercial insulin, which was an animal-derived product. People like to say insulin's 100 years old, but speaking to a room full of innovators, it's changed a lot through the years, and mostly for the better. Actually, changes in insulin alone have prolonged the lives of people with type 1 diabetes by about 20 years since the middle 1930s. But these products are older. We got into a strange situation where you had this very large difference between list price and net price. We had tried many things to address that, including launching a generic against our own product at a low list price. By the way, that generic's available now for $25 a vial for Humalog. And a lot of that didn't work. And the reason is, I think, there's just a lot of dysfunction in benefit design in the United States. To work around that, we've now applied an automatic buy down to $35. No matter how much insulin you buy per month, your cap is $35. Lilly's picking that up, the difference between your insurance coverage and $35. For some people, that difference is zero. For others, it's hundreds and hundreds of dollars. We just did that as a leadership move and to just try to get out of this conversation about, is it the drug price or is it insurance design? Of course, it was both. We've addressed our part. I'm waiting for the insurance design to change. Today in the US, about a third of people are in very high deductible plans, a third of insulin users, and in many cases, the first $5,000 of drug costs are on them at list price, even though the acquisition cost for their insurance company is often 85% less. So they're paying full freight, the insurance is paying a lot less than they are. That's kind of a reverse insurance idea, because that cash they put in the system doesn't go to us, the manufacturer, it goes to the insurance entity, and they use it mostly to buy down premiums for people who don't have diabetes. So we need to get to a world in the US where patients pay cost sharing based on net price, not list. And we probably need to get to a world where deductibles as a concept don't make a lot of sense in chronic disease. Your disease didn't change from December 31st to January 1st, but your cost does. All that causes is discontinuation, and I think we need to get out of that mode as a country.
Right. And then lastly, while we're talking about price, I wanted to get you draw from your knowledge base of being CEO, but also chair of the pharma group. Give us your thoughts, updated thoughts on how the IRA has progressed, just with respect to Merck's suit last week, and kind of what you expect this fall, but more importantly going forward.
I expect more lawsuits. I think the chamber actually filed one Friday too. Yep. Obviously, Merck's complaint outlines a lot of the issues. We would agree with many of the points they make. It's not a negotiation. We already have negotiation, by the way, in Part D, which is just with actors that the government hires to negotiate with us. The process has a lot of extreme unfairness and one-sidedness to it. So let's not pretend that's what it is. It's price setting. And if they wanted to set a price, pass a price setting bill, they should have called it that. With that, I think even if we accept that this will all happen the way it has, I think the primary complaint we have is with the 9 years on so-called small molecules or chemicals. Organic chemistry is a good way to solve medical problems, but it's pretty significantly discriminated against. And just maybe final comment about the general environment and policy is there's a lot of proposed changes coming. I know Dr. Califf will be here. The FDA has been asked to change its policies in many ways. IP is under attack, march-in rights, et cetera. All this does is discourage investment. And I think last time I checked, there's plenty of problems to go solve with medicines. And probably we want more investment privately, not less. And I guess at the end of the day, most of these things won't occur, but it does cause, I think, investors to pause and direct their money to artificial intelligence companies or other things. And I'm not sure that's a great outcome for our country.
With that, we're out of time. So Dave, thank you very much.
Thanks, Geoff. Yeah, appreciate you being here. Thank you.
So how about another round of applause for